Okay, so here we have inflation, disinflation, and deflation, which is important to know about. So basically, I'm gonna explain to you guys what they are and the costs that come with inflation, disinflation, and deflation. So, or actually, I think I'm just going with the cost of inflation. Cost of inflation, sorry. So, inflation is the sustained increase in general price level. Okay? So, inflation would be prices going from $0 to, or actually, let's just do $1 to $2 on average, which would be representative of 100% increase in price level. So that'd be 100% rate of inflation, right? And it's over a given period of time, right? So this 100% could be over 100 years or it could be 2 years. Typically, it'll be over a year. Disinflation is a decrease in the rate of inflation. So instead of inflation being 8%, it goes down to 2%. It's still, price levels are still going up but by not as much. And then we have deflation, where price levels actually decrease. So it'd be going from like 1% to minus 10%, right? Price levels are actually falling. Okay. Typically, you want the inflation rate to hover around 2 to 3-ish% per year. And effectively what this inflation number impacts is the CPI, also known as the Consumer Price Index, which is basically a amalgamation of different consumer goods, and then basically you average the price of it, right? So very quickly, there are two types of inflation that we need to know about, which is cost push inflation, which is caused by a leftward shift in AS. This is also known as stagflation, which you basically want to avoid at all costs. That's like worst case scenario. Did I just write AS with a Z? AS. Then we have demand pull inflation, which is caused by a rightwards shift in AD. Okay. So, the way that consumer price index kind of works and inflation is that it decreases or it impacts real income. And you might be asking, well, what is real income? Well, real income, like real GDP, is income adjusted for the rate of inflation. So the one way that I would go over this is that let's say that my salary increased by 10%, right? But the rate of inflation was 15%. Even though on paper my salary is 10% higher, I actually have less real income because the rate of inflation is greater than my increase in salary. Okay? And what real income displays is something called purchasing power. And the colloquial way of saying this is how much bang for your buck can you get? So for every dollar that you have, how much can you buy? The higher your purchasing power, the more you can buy with a dollar. Okay, so now we have the costs of inflation. So there are many costs to inflation, and one of the main ones is the redistribution effect. I like to think of this as a scale going off balance, right? So originally, income was quite balanced around the economy, but what happens is that inflation actually impacts low-income consumers disproportionately. So this is called the redistribution effect, right? Where in the short run, wages are fixed, And what happens is that typically people that have fixed wages are low income. So typically it will be people that have a pension, so retirees, people who are like running rental businesses where they get set income from their rental, and welfare. And I think this one is the most important one to keep note of, that it affects people that are on welfare, so people who are unemployed, right? So what happens is, because they're low income, and in the short run their wages are fixed, they are worse off. Well, why is this? Well, because there's a decrease in purchasing power. So for every dollar, so I'm going to write PPP for purchasing power, which is something called the purchasing power parity, but it's the same thing, where they have a decrease in purchasing power. Why? Well, because there is an increase in the costs of living. So costs of living go up, but their wages are equal. Their wages stay the same, right? And what this can do is ultimately it can lead to personal costs. This is what we were talking about when we were talking about unemployment. And you don't want people in your country to be depressed, really. Even if you just look at it economically, you want people to be happy. Okay? So, the other thing is that there are costs to certain stakeholders, but there are benefits to others. Now, the benefit is for the payers, the people that are paying for these wages. They're better off. Well, why is this? Well, it's because in the short run, these wages are fixed. So even though they can sell their goods for more, their costs are the same, right? Those are my points. For some reason, it won't let me highlight all of them. Oh, yeah, I did. Right? Because what they end up doing is that they actually end up paying less in real terms. Okay? Where typically they'll have to pay less as well if, as I stated before, the income increases by a small amount, but inflation increases by a much larger amount, right? And this leads the payers to be better off within this scenario. Okay? Now, the thing is that it also has effects on economic stimulus, let's say. So basically people saving or spending money, right? What it does is that typically it disincentivizes people from saving. Because what happens is that the money that they have sitting in their bank will lose value depending on how high the interest rate is. So why am I going to keep money in a bank if it's going to lose value when I can just spend it right now? Right? So holders of cash, i.e. people who save a lot of money, are worse off. Because what happens is that the money that they have sitting in that bank account decreases in value, okay? On the condition that the interest rate which they get on the savings that they put into this bank is lower than inflation. So if, for example, interest is 5%, but inflation is only 4%, they will still be incentivized to save because they're making 1%, right? Whereas if it's the other way around, then that will no longer be the case, okay? Now, the problem is that when it comes to inflation, it can sometimes be considered a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the reason for that is that when people are uncertain about saving because of the fact that their value, like if I have $100,000 and then all of a sudden the next day it's only worth $80,000, well, why am I going to wait till tomorrow to spend my $80,000 when I could have spent it today for $100,000? So what happens is that if there's an uncertainty in saving, it will lead to spending within the economy, because people are like, well, why am I going to wait for my money to decrease in value when I can spend it now? And the problem is that because there is an increase in spending, price level goes up because there's more demand. And if price level goes up, there's an increase in inflation. Okay? Now, what happens is that borrowers, that shouldn't be green, people who are taking the money are better off. And the reason why is because they have to return a lower real value than what they borrowed it for. So, for example, they borrowed $100,000, but then the next day, and they got to spend that money. Okay, they spent their $100,000 of the money they borrowed, and the next day, it's worth only $80,000. Remember, it's still $100,000 like number, but in real terms, what it's actually worth is only worth $80,000 compared to what it was yesterday. Now what I can do is I can give back my money to whoever I borrowed it from, and I don't make $20,000, but I'm better off because I borrowed $100,000 worth of money, but I only had to return $80,000 worth in real terms. The other way that you could think about it is with this $100,000, when I borrowed the money, I could buy, I don't know, 5 apples, right? I could buy 5 apples with the $100,000 that I borrowed. But then because of inflation, the next day, I could only borrow $4 for apples, right? So what this is showing is that even though I borrowed 5 apples worth of money, when I gave it back, it was only worth 4 apples. So I'm better off. And then lenders are worse off for the same reason. Okay, because the value of the money that they lent has decreased in value. Okay. Now, another disadvantage of inflation is that it makes, it can actually cause decreases in our GDP. And the reason it can cause increases and decreases, you can alter your argument depending on what you want to show, right? But inflation means that the cost of your goods are more expensive. And what that means is that your country becomes less attractive for exports. And we remember that X minus M is a contributor for net exports is a contributor to our GDP. The country becomes less attractive because goods and services within that country are more expensive. So why am I going to buy it there if I could go to another country without the same rate of inflation and buy it for cheaper? And that's the cost of inflation to different stakeholders. Yeah. Okay, basically, one thing which I didn't realize I needed to add was limitations of CPI, which is what is used to calculate purchasing power. And yeah, so basically, within the consumer price index, there are some issues and limitations towards using it, okay? One of them is that there's different rates of inflation for people with different incomes. And you might be thinking, well, why is that? That doesn't really make sense because, if money's decreasing in value, it affects everyone equally, but it doesn't. Because what happens is that if people are different incomes, there's different goods and services which they would purchase. And the thing is that these different goods and services that are in the basket have different rates of inflation. So for example, we'll use the example that I used earlier. So let's say we have hot dogs, right, which is an inferior good, and hamburgers, which is, in our hypothetical case, a superior good, right? Those look pretty similar, but I think you got the idea. That's my hamburger. Let's say there's an increase in the rate of inflation for 10% for hot dogs, but only 2% for hamburgers, right? This 2% is going to be what high-income consumers are buying, and this is what low-income consumers are buying. And you can see how, even though the consumer price index would say that there's an average of 6% inflation because of these two being added together, what happens is that the people with low income are experiencing the inflation at a much more severe rate compared to the people with high income, right? It's the same thing. That same concept applies for regional demand. So, for example, if we are a country which consumes a lot of spice and there's a high rate of inflation with spice, people that consume different foods might be affected more greatly. So, for example, people from India will use more spice compared to people from, I don't know, the United States, right? So they'll be affected more so by the inflation. Then what happens is that there can be changes in consumption patterns due to substitute goods, due to the price change. So, for example, if hot dogs price goes up by 10%, and it's so high that I'm just going to switch to hamburgers, that might be what happens, right? And the problem is that when you calculate consumer price index, things are given different weightings, which means that they feel that this good is more significant towards the good. So, for example, a commodity that is very important to everyone and will have a high weight will be the price of oil, because it is used in almost everything, right? Whereas something more niche, like, I don't know, Tostito chips, might not have as great of a weighting, okay? Another example of this would be changes in consumption patterns because of the introduction of new products. Because the problem is with the CPI is that it's a fixed set of goods. So it's going to stay the same for the basket of goods, the goods which we are purchasing, are going to stay the same until they're updated by the next year. So if all of a sudden this new iPhone comes out, and everyone starts buying this new iPhone, but the iPhone isn't included in the CPI, it could be slightly inaccurate. Another example is changes in product quality. If we continue to produce bags, for example, but the bags are very low quality, it doesn't actually measure that. It can't account for changes in quality over a larger period of time. Another issue is that CPIs in different countries differ from each other. So the goods that China might put in here is different from the goods that the United States might also put in there, right? And yeah, that's it. Okay, hope this was helpful.